Okay, guys, we're here. It's Gencon week, so we're going to be getting our Clone Wars news this week. So I want to wrap up my potential rules changes for in terms of points adjustments. Today we're going to talk about ships and their titles. Tomorrow we'll talk about commanders. Then Wednesday I'm going to do some final thoughts before we get our announcement, and possibly even Wednesday night do a wrap up after the live stream wraps with some thoughts after that. Remember, please give a like and subscribe if these are helpful to you. I plan to be doing as much Armada news as I possibly can, along with some Legion news. I'm a much bigger Armada player, although I like Legion a lot and I design terrain for it. I love designing the terrain and setting up dioramas and stuff like that. Um, but Armada is the game that I like to play. Um, so let's talk about ships. A couple of things about this. So first of all, with the ship cards themselves, I would never advocate, and I don't think FFG would ever change anything on the cards except for possibly the points. I don't want them changing any of the other stats. It would cause too many problems. It would change the ship tokens. It would change too much. So I would never advocate for doing anything to ship cards and ship tokens other than potentially changing the points. Now, some of these I've included the ship and some titles. In some cases, it's just one ship version and no titles. Sometimes I just have a title with no ship changes. I'm going to do similar to what I've done before. I'm going to start with the Rebels and go to the Imperials. I've got a few more changes to the Rebels on this one, I think, but a couple of the bigger changes are in the Imperials. So let's get started. So talk about the Corvette B. So the Corvette B, it's the cheaper version of the CR90. It's basically only really used with Dodonna and Dodonna's Pride on it, at least as far as I've seen. It's not a ship that gets a terrible amount of play otherwise. Uh, it's a CR90, which is a small ship. It's a relatively weak defensively ship, and because it's all blue dice, it wants to get relatively close to ships. And medium range is a really tough range to zero in on. It's the narrowest of ranges. It's a lot easier to stay long range, and close range is a pretty wide area. Medium range is really tight, so either you're going to just miss it and not get a shot, or you're going to overshoot it and be in close range, which is going to be bad for you defensively. Um, so because of that, I think the CR90B could stand a little points reduction, maybe 2 points or so, just to get maybe people a little bit more interested, let it fit into a few more lists where you wouldn't be able to get a more expensive ship. Then we have the Assault Frigate. Assault Frigate is a relatively good ship. It's good at a lot of things. It's not great at anything really, but it is a solid ship. Um, but in terms of the Assault Frigate especially the Assault Frigate Mark II-A, I think it's a little overcosted. Most people are going to take the Assault Frigate B. It's significantly cheaper, and the stats are very similar, and you even get an extra squadron with the B. With the A, you do get a little bit better anti-squadron shot. You get a couple extra dice in the front and the rear, but otherwise you're not getting a heck of a lot for the extra cost here. So I think the A could stand a 3 or 4 point decrease. Now, going along with that, I think both of the titles for the Assault Frigate have trouble nowadays. The Gallant Haven, allows it provides protection to squadrons that are in range 1 of you. Range 1 is super close. It's hard to keep squadrons that close, and you're really using them as a defensive screen at that point. I don't think using squadrons as a defensive screen is always the best strategy. You're soaking up a lot of points just to protect a ship, where they might be better off going out and probing your enemy, so to speak. So I do think that this one, because it's a little bit hard to pull off, and because it's relatively expensive at 8 points, could definitely see a points reduction here of, I'd even go half. I'd go down to 4 on this one. Paragon, similar. Paragon, the title sounds great. If you're attacking a ship you already attacked that round, you get a black dice. That means you have to be double arced with a ship in order to get both shots, and then you're only getting it on the second shot. And double arcing, especially because you don't want to be close range with the assault frigate. You're more of a long to medium range ship, so lining up those double arcs can be more difficult. This is something that if you pull it off a couple of times a game, you're doing really well. So you're getting a couple of extra black dice throughout the game. I don't think it's necessarily a great title, but I think to see it at all, you really have to reduce the price by a couple of points. It's only a 5-point title, but even still, I think you'd have to reduce it by a couple points to see it in play anymore. Now, with the MC80, I don't have problems with the MC80 ship. I don't have problems with most of the titles, but the Independence title, it's not a great title. It's relatively expensive, again, at 8 points. It allows you to push your squadrons out at speed 4, so it's good for B-Wings. You get to get one good push of your B-Wings out, as an example. The problem with it is when you use the ability, those squadrons can't attack in that activation. You could put Adar Talon, who's a super expensive officer on there, and then one of them you could flip the activation slider and let them go and attack. But that's one squadron, a lot of points sunk into that one shot. I just don't think it's a great title. If it didn't have that restriction of not being able to attack in that activation, then sure, I think it's okay. But with that restriction, I think it needs a big reduction in points. Probably down to half, like 4. The Hammerhead Scout Corvette. So these are already cheap ships. And I'm not going to talk about the Torpedo, but the Scout, you don't see it nearly as much. The dice, it's better long range, which is good for a Hammerhead. But Hammerheads have lots of problems. They're weak. They have weak shields. They, not great hull. They probably have the weirdest movement chart in the entire game. To me, it's bizarre. To me, the movement chart for the Hammerhead, so they're difficult to fly. I would like to see the Scout Corvette reduced a little bit in price. You can't go very far, from 41, but I'd reduce it a couple of points, get it down into the high 30s, 38, 39 points, and I think you might see it a little bit more. Now, to go along with that, the one title that I want to talk about with the Hammerhead is Task Force Antilles. You have the Task Force Argana, which is 1 point, which is an offensive ability, and they're task force titles, so that means multiple ships can have it. And at 1 point, that's pretty good. You're getting a decent ability with the Task Force Argana. With the Task Force Antilles, it's 3 points. And again, you have to multiply that across however many ships you're going to put it on. And usually, if you're using this, you're not doing just 2, you're doing 3 or 4. And that ends up sinking a lot of points into the ships and the titles in order to pull it all off. So I would advocate for reducing the Task Force Antilles title by 1 point, go down to 2. GR75, the only thing that I have to say about the GR75, at least, not the combat one, but with the medium transport, yeah, it doesn't have an attack, but it's an activation, and it's cheaper than a lot of squadrons. And sometimes that activation is more valuable than a squadron. So I would advocate for increasing the price of the medium transport up to 20 probably. Now this is going to wrap up the Rebels, so I have a lot to say about the Nebby, and I'm going to say a lot of the first wave, the core set type ships, have more adjustments that could be made than a lot of the other ships. I think it's just because it was a new game. They wanted people to be able to fill out their 400-point lists a little bit easier. So in a lot of senses, a lot of things tied to these ships are a little bit more expensive than they should be, especially some of the titles. But as far as the support refit, you don't see it a lot. One of the problems with the Nebby is, for a long time, the only time you would see a Nebby is with it running Yavaris, which we're going to talk about in a second. And in order to do that, you needed the more expensive with the 2 squadron ship. So you never would really see the support refit. Since Rebellion in the Rim, Nebby has gotten a little bit more rounded out. It's a little bit better, but I would still advocate for the support refit, getting a reduction in points, a couple of point reduction. Now, in terms of the titles for the Nebulon B, I've got 3 of them here. These are the original 3, 2 in the core set. One of them, I think it was 2 in the core set, and 1 came in the expansion. Might be the other way around, I can't remember. But we have Redemption, and they're all good abilities. When a friendly ship at distance 1 to 5 resolves the engineering command, it can gain an engineering point, which is valuable, but it's expensive at 8 points. Now, I'm not going to say what I think about this because I want to get through all 3 of them first. Then we have Salvation. Salvation allows your crits coming out of your front hull zone to count as 2 points instead of 2 damage instead of 1, which is, again, really powerful. 7-point title, a little bit expensive. Then we have Yavaris. This is the ubiquitous one, the one that you're going to see far more often than either of the other titles, where you can activate, or each squadron that you activate can shoot twice during its activation if it doesn't move. And there's a lot of ways to be able to pull this off, which is why it's so popular. So I'm not going to necessarily say, so I think you go 1 of 2 ways on this one. Either you reduce the price of Redemption and Salvation, or you increase the price of Yavaris. Now, because I think that the other titles are valuable and worthwhile, I'm going to lean towards increasing the price of Yavaris, and probably up to that 8-point range, just to make people think a little bit about what title that they want to use. Make the ubiquitousness, if that's a word, probably not even a word, of Yavaris, become not such a thing. So now we're going to some Imperials. So I do have the Vic 2 Star Destroyer here. And at 85 points, I think it's just a little bit expensive. There's a lot of other choices out there, Star Destroyers are way more powerful. I mean, granted, they're, you know, uh, you know, 20 to 30 points more expensive, but they're so much more powerful. I think that they're that much better. Now, granted, it is a lot of point difference, so sometimes this is all you can fit in your list. But you know, victories, they're slow, they're not maneuverable. I mean, they have the Harrow title now and stuff, so there's at least one version of it that you can get and push it out a little bit. But that makes it even more expensive because then you have to add engine techs plus the title and everything else, so it's getting even more expensive. So I think to see the Vic 2 out there more, especially this version, you need to drop the points down probably to 80 in order to see it a little bit more. Then I do have the Dominator title in here as well. Dominator, super expensive title at 12. It does have an excellent ability. I just think that the title, especially when you're adding it to a ship that I think is a little bit expensive, you just don't see it. So I would advocate both reducing the price of the Victory and reducing the price of Dominator. And Dominator, I'd go down, the upper range of what I think is, kind of valid for most titles. We'll get to another one in a minute, but get down to that 8 range, 7-8 point range, and I think you would see it a lot more. Now for the Star Destroyer, Star Destroyer has a lot of good titles. I have no problems with the points of the ships. Just Devastator you don't see very much. Devastator has a big tax on it too. You have to have spent your defense tokens in order to be able to get the extra dice from Devastator. So in theory, if you spent 3 or 4 defense tokens, you're getting 3 or 4 extra dice. But by the time you've spent 3 or 4 defense tokens, your ship is probably pretty hurting at that point, and just getting it to survive to the point where it can use the title is going to be a challenge. So I advocate, because there's such a big tax on the ability, I would reduce the price, the cost of this one down quite a bit, probably to 4 or 5 points at the most. And even then, honestly, I'm not sure that you would see it very much, just because it has such a negative tax to it. You might not see it even then. Alright, so now let's get into the Gladiator. So how many times have you played a game with a Gladiator, either against somebody or your own list, and it hasn't had the Demolisher title? It's so ubiquitous that a lot of people call it a Demolisher Star Destroyer, and it's not. Some people mistake it as it's a Demolisher Star Destroyer, and it's not. It's a Gladiator Star Destroyer with the Dominator. It's a Gladiator Star Destroyer with the Demolisher title. So this is about the only way that people will run a Gladiator. Now, I have seen on Facebook groups and some people talking about it that this is a ship that they would like to see a points reduction on, so that it would be more viable to bring out as, a generically named ship, or maybe even get the Insidious title in there a little bit more. The Insidious title is a really tough title. I'm not going to talk about it. I don't think it needs a points change, but I also don't think it's a super great title. But I'm not going to advocate at all for reducing the points of the Gladiator, because then you're just going to see Demolisher even more. If anything, I would increase the price slightly of the Gladiator. The problem with Demolisher is it's already a 10-point title, but it's so good. It's such a good title that the points almost don't matter on this one. You're automatically including that 10 points in the cost of the ship, because if you want to include a Gladiator in your list, you know you're going to put Demolisher on it. And it's really hard for me to say to increase the points of a 10-point title. But in this case, I think you almost have to. And you almost have to increase it by 3 or 4 points. It's such a good title. It's, probably the most powerful title in the game. It's a really tough one for me because I would like to see more Gladiators out there, more multiple Gladiator lists, which you just never see. I mean, if somebody has a Gladiator, it's one and it's a Demolisher. I've seen people goof around trying to get multiple, Gladiator lists to work, but they almost never do. So this is one that I'm going to leave up in the air a little bit. I'm going to advocate probably for increasing the title points, the title cost, but even, will just say I disagree with some people's thoughts about decreasing the cost of the Star Destroyer itself, because I think that would just make the problem worse. And now, finally, this is the big one for me. Interdictor Combat Refit. It's just, you never see this version of the ship. It's only got one of its, its special slots in order to get the special interdictor things on there. And then you're trading out pretty much a blue dice and getting it to a red, so then it's a combat refit, I guess. But then they left, in the upgrade slots, they left it as an ion cannon slot. If it's going to be a combat refit, it should have been a turbo laser slot. If it was a turbo laser slot, I think, okay, I could make a case for this being where it's at. But with the ion cannon slot, that red dice, you can't do much with it. And I'd prefer to have the blue dice, honestly. So with this where it's at, and using my theory going forward with these videos, is we're not changing the cards, just the point values. The combat refit has to get reduced in a lot. I mean, it should be cheaper than the other version, and it's 3 points more expensive. So I'm going to advocate maybe even a whole 10-point reduction to the Interdictor Combat Refit. I feel like it was totally miscast when it was brought into the game. I don't know, why they thought that this would ever see play. So I'm going to advocate for a whole 10-point reduction on the Interdictor Combat Refit. Right, so what do you think? What ships do you think need a point reduction or increase, or titles? Leave them in the comments below. Maybe I'll revisit this later and we'll talk about it some more later. I'd like to hear what you have to think. Thanks a lot again for watching. Keep watching this week because it's going to be an exciting week. A lot of news coming this week. Can't wait. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks.